It is terrific to be able to talk about Hildegard as the genius she was, and the genius she displayed so often in the massive and diverse character of her recorded intellectual vigor. She was also distinctive for her charismatic relationship, not just with several ecclesiastical communities, but with large crowds of the general public, a unique phenomenon of which, yet more incredibly, the establishment seems to have entirely approved. But perhaps Hildegard is most extraordinary in an interior dimension, in the precarious balance she somehow maintained between her instinctual rapport with established authority and her indomitable determination to be true to her individual inspiration. She was just responding to God's inspiration, not her own, she said, and she claimed with seeming sincerity that her visions and her most daring deeds were God's will and a command to her. In spite of constant illness and severe pain, she lived a life of extraordinary accomplishment. Furthermore, she stayed sane despite the normally centrifugal tension between authority and individuality, and she did so for just under 80 years. In this lecture, I want to talk about Hildegard's later life in the context of her writing and her community. By the late 1140s, Hildegard was already famous for her musical poetry and for her visionary prose. As we said, Pope Eugenius III had approved her visionary prophecies. Later popes allowed her to go about the Rhineland preaching her version of church reform. Church reform. She became an advisor to the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. A prolific writer of Latin prose and verse on many subjects, always outspoken, she was someone that the monks of Despottenberg wanted to keep, and she was the one who wanted to move. They were very much opposed to her moving. Her community had become to them a major asset. Despottenberg was also a delightful and well-cultivated setting. The monks could not understand the desire of hers to move away. 2 years later, nevertheless, in 1150, Hildegard moved to a nearby mountaintop sacred to the memory of a local bishop, St. Rupert, and founded there a monastery for women, of which she became head. Archbishop Henry of Mainz consecrated the abbey church in 1152. Mount St. Rupertsberg was a barren and wild place, a perfect context for monastic life as she understood it. The monastic life had always been, in ideal, a life of withdrawal from the world. Hildegard, for all of her visionary ecstasy, had also a literal streak in her. Perhaps we should also recall that Peter Abelard founded what became Eloise's monastery, the Paraclete, in a wild forest on the banks of the River Seine. The local Saint Rupert had lived some 3.5 centuries before Hildegard came to Rupertsberg. He was a Frank who had been Bishop of Worms in the Rhine, and he did missionary work in Bavaria and around Salzburg. But he was buried back home, and his tomb gave its way and its name to that wild mountain. The Rupertsberg is a very dramatic site. It looks down on the city of Bingen, once a Roman settlement, and near the Rhine itself, where its tributary, the Nahe, flows into the great stream. Nearby is a bridge over the Nahe attributed to the Romans. Some 20 nuns accompanied Hildegard to her new home. Their numbers began to grow. Hildegard's monastery was richly expanded after her death, becoming a major monument of Romanesque architecture. Unfortunately, it was very badly damaged by Swedish Protestant troops in 1632. The nuns moved across the Rhine to Ibenen. The ruins were raided for building materials for 2 centuries, and they were finally destroyed in the 19th century, thanks to a tunnel blasted for railroad construction. Hildegard was, like Eloise, a monastic builder. 15 years after her first foundation in Rupertsberg in 1165, Hildegard founded a daughter house across the Rhine at Ibenen on a hill over Rudesheim. She would cross the great river every other week to supervise that second community. Ibenen became, in the 20th century, the cradle of the Hildegardian revival. Unfortunately for Hildegard, in 1151, she lost her dear assistant Ricardus the year they moved to the Rupertsberg. We'll return to their story later. But fortunately, Volmir stayed with Hildegard as her spiritual director and as her secretary, and did not die until 1173 when she was 75. Hildegard was famous even in her old age. She became a famous preacher. Contemporary admirers claimed that the popes commanded that she go on preaching tours and that she preached not just to the clergy but to the general public. This was a very unusual role for a woman in medieval Christian Europe. As far as documents can demonstrate, it was unique. At least it was for Orthodox Catholic women. Some radical Christian women tried to do that now and again, but they usually paid a deadly price. Between 1158 and 1171, despite her chronically poor health, Hildegard went on 4 preaching tours across Germany, as far north as Cologne and as far east as Bamberg. As far as we know, she never had to deal with any backlash about her preaching tours. She had to cope with lots of carping from subordinates, equals, and superiors about lots of other matters, but about this, the most unique of her roles, there was never any talk. Her favorite topics on these tours were the need to reform the church, which she saw as decadently effeminate, and the imminence of the end of the world, which she described in very vivid language. It wasn't just that she went on preaching tours. Most strikingly, she struck up a friendship and became an advisor to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, who reigned from 1152 to 1190, known as Barbarossa, Redbeard in Italian. He was the king of Italy and Burgundy, as well as a German king. Frederick was a committed patron of the arts and of theological and historical speculation. He was high-minded, opinionated. In 1152, the year Frederick was elected German king, Hildegard wrote him a letter of congratulations. In 1154, Barbarossa invited her to meet him at Ingelheim on the Rhine, a huge imperial palace dating back to Charlemagne. The meeting must have been a personal success because Barbarossa continued to respect Hildegard, even though she had opposed his policy towards the popes, regarded her well. The imperial party seems to have regarded her as a person of integrity, even though she was frequently inconveniently full of integrity. This was one case, however, where her integrity did not allow her to go along, at least with secular authority. It's interesting to try to imagine what Hildegard and Barbarossa must have seen in each other. The godlike golden youth, aflame with imperially generous ambition, and the weak woman, as she insisted upon describing herself, famous but frail in her mid-50s. She must have seen in him the qualities of viriditas, the greenness, is almost an inadequate translation, and of virilitas, which she so admired, the green man. More of them soon. He must have embodied these qualities for her. But what did he like so much in her? It's good to remember that even emperors can be famous for their discernment, and he made a cult of honest loyalty. We know of 4 occasions when Hildegard gave him advice after they met in 1154. All 4 opinions dealt with Barbarossa's opposition to Pope Alexander III, who was pope from 1159 to 1181, against whom Barbarossa rallied factions of bishops to elect 3 anti-popes. The first time Hildegard urged Frederick to desist. The second time she took a neutral position, but the third time she opposed the imperial anti-pope. And the 4th time she warned the emperor to discontinue this policy of recruiting and supporting rivals to Pope Alexander III. We remember that an anti-pope is a rival to a duly elected pope whose side has won the ultimate support, at which point his rival is called the anti-pope. Barbarossa enjoyed encouraging minority groups of cardinals to withdraw from papal elections and to choose their own candidate. These anti-popes, supported by Barbarossa, continued to exercise papal authority until death in the territories supported by Barbarossa and controlled by him and his allies. Barbarossa chose 3 consecutive rivals to the exceptionally long-lived, duly elected Pope Alexander III, who was committed to maintaining the reform policies of his predecessors. Untypically, Barbarossa treated Hildegard with kindly respect, even though he did not follow her advice. In fact, the only surviving document addressing Hildegard as an abbess, not merely the prioress of a community dependent upon the abbot of Disibodenberg, is a charter of Barbarossa's. In 1176, 8 years after her last warning about supporting anti-popes, Barbarossa was humiliatingly defeated at the Battle of Legnano in northern Italy and promptly had to make peace with Pope Alexander III. Hildegard's reputation as a predictive prophet was hence further enhanced. Hildegard got along well with Frederick Barbarossa despite her support for the Papal Reform Party. It's important to realize how exceptionally well Hildegard was treated by the male leadership of church and state in a century that was growing consistently more misogynist. The 12th century opened with Fulbert dreaming of an educated career for his dear niece Eloise, but closed with a total rejection of women from the new universities and the demonization of such women as Eleanor of Aquitaine. When Hildegard moved to Rupertsberg in her early 50s, she began her major life's work. It's fascinating to see how she talked about that work. She, who spoke to popes and emperors, spoke as if she knew nothing and had never read anything. This is surely a paradox. But as one scholar says, Hildegard would certainly have been aware of the wealth of learned matter in her own revelations. The more acutely does her prophetic role demand an autobiographical interpretation that accepts only divine intervention as the essential source for her culture. That is, Hildegard pretends that she has no learned debts, and this in some ways also justifies her sense that she is not competing with anyone else in the clerical world. What is this constant statement of humility, so unlike, for example, Abelard? Is it just characteristic of women? Surely not, for we see it everywhere in the Middle Ages. And one of its most beautiful statements is found in one of Hildegard's secretaries who writes to her, Ludwig, and he says to her, "It would seem ridiculous enough if butterflies greeted eagles, if fleas greeted stags, if worms greeted lions in their letters. So it is more wondrous, indeed laughable, than a sinner worth little or nothing in divine or human arts should presume to write to one, Hildegard, whom the Lord has magnified so high." Asserting humility, claiming to know nothing, not relying on the record of written authority, also, I think, provides a certain kind of protective coloration for this daring woman. Remember Hildegard's letter to Bernard? When Hildegard wrote to Bernard of Clairvaux in 1147 to make sure he would not disapprove of her visionary experience, she deliberately underplayed how much literature she knew and how uneducated she was. Surely at that point she was not unaware of Bernard's hostility, perhaps even competitiveness with Abelard, and for the use of secular learning, to which Bernard was deeply opposed. She had explained to him, remember, that it was in a flash that she understood the central meaning of the Psalter, the Gospels, and all the other books of the Old and the New Law. She did not reveal to Bernard what she later revealed often, and that was that she had understood and read the writings of lots of ancient philosophers, of lots of saints, and she understood with Bernard that it was useful, with Bernard and with others, to present herself as a mere weak woman, unlearned, unlettered. She was careful not to put herself by way of disapproval because her learning was too great. She also, in one letter to another friend, the later secretary helper Guibert, uses lovely language to describe both her weakness and her visions. It's so important as the core of Hildegard's self-perception that it's worth quoting at length. She says to Guibert, "Then how could it be that I, poor little creature, should not know myself? God works where he wills, to the glory of his name, not that of earthbound man. But I am always filled with a trembling fear, as I do not know for certain any single capacity in me. Yet I stretch out my hands to God, so that, like a feather which lacks all weight and substance and flies through the wind, I may be borne up by God. And I cannot see perfectly the things that I see in my bodily condition and in my invisible soul, for in these two man is defective. Since my infancy, however, when I was not yet strong in my bones and nerves and veins, I've always seen this vision in my soul, even until now, when I'm more than 70 years old, and God wills, in this vision my spirit mounts upwards into the height of the firmament and the changing air, and dilates itself among different nations, even though they are in far-off regions remote from me. And because I see things in such a manner, I behold them in the changing form of clouds and other created things. I do not hear them with my physical ears, nor with my heart's thoughts, nor do I perceive them by bringing any of my five senses to bear, but only my soul, my physical eyes open, so that I never suffer their failing in loss of consciousness. No, I see these things wakefully, day and night. I am constantly oppressed by illness, and so enmeshed in intense pains that they threaten to bring on my death. But so far, God has saved me. The brightness that I see is not spatial, yet it is far more lucent than a cloud that envelops the sun. I cannot contemplate height or length or breadth in it. I call it the shadow of the living brightness. And as sun, moon, and stars appear mirrored in water, so scriptures, discourses, virtues, and some works of men take form for me and are reflected radiant in this brightness. I retain the memories of these visions, so that because I've seen it at some time, I can remember it. And I see, hear, and know simultaneously, and learn what I know in a moment. But what I do not see, I do not know, for I am not learned. And the things that I write are those I see and hear through the vision. Nor do I set down words other than those I hear. I utter them in unpolished Latin, just as I hear them through the vision. For in it I am not taught to write as philosophers write. And the words I see and hear through the vision are not words that come from human lips, but like a sparkling flame in a cloud moved in pure air. I cannot know the form of brightness in this way, just as I cannot completely look at the sphere of the sun. And in that same brightness, I sometimes, not often, see another light, which I call the living light. When and how I see it, I cannot express. But when I do, all sadness and anguish is taken away from me. And then I have the air of an innocent young girl, and not that of a little old woman. I at times grow weary because of my constant illness. And when I see and hear the vision, then my soul drains as from a fountain, yet the fountain stays full and never drainable. But my soul at no time lacks the brightness called the shadow of the living brightness. I see as if I were gazing into a starless firmament within a lucent cloud. And there I see the things I often declare, and those I give as answers to people who ask me, from out of the blaze of the living light. She wrote voluminously. We'll return to her later writings and music in subsequent lectures, but here I want to pay particular attention to her Civias, which the Pope himself so enjoyed. She composed 3 extended Latin treatises between 1141 and 1174, between the ages of 43 and 76. She entitled the first part of this trilogy Civias, which is a kind of Latin pun on the injunction, know, sire, the ways, vias, of the Lord. This is the book which she felt impelled by divine command to write in order to record the visions about the church which she had been having since she was a child. Civias consists of these 3 books reporting and commenting on 26 of her visions, preceded by a preface stating her intentions as author. Book 1 deals with 6 visions of the Creator and his creation. Book 2 deals with 7 visions of the Redeemer and his redemption of the human race. And Book 3 doubles the number of visions, presenting 13 of them about the history of salvation, as represented by a building, which is essentially the church. These visions have important visual dimensions as well as compelling language describing and explaining them. It's fascinating to see these brilliantly colored illustrations that accompany the texts of Hildegard's visions. Fortunately, these paintings were exactly copied in the 1930s, since the original illuminated manuscript was almost certainly destroyed in Dresden, where it had been sent for safekeeping in the British firebombing of that city towards the end of the Second World War. The Civias is a collection of Hildegard the Prophet's very visual visions. She was a seer in modern English. Seers become that because they frequently see things other human beings do not. These visions were usually strange, unlike daily visual reality. Hildegard, as I said, was subject to chronic illness, probably migraines. Were her visions delusions, a result of brainstorms caused by chemical imbalances? Madeline Cavaness, the art historian who was particularly effective as an interpreter of medieval stained glass, has argued that Hildegard either painted herself the brilliant illuminations of the original manuscript of the Civias or sketched and directed their execution. The key to Cavaness's theory is the extent to which the composition of those paintings could be determined and exactly the sort of visual distortions to which migraine syndromes give rise. Advocates argue that the visions can be both migraine-related and simultaneously inspired insights. Weinstein and Bell, on the other hand, have pointed out in their statistical study of saints in Western Christendom between the year 1000 and 1700 that female saints have claimed illness as a sign of divine favor many more times than male saints have. Hildegard's series of illnesses, too irregular to be chronic, properly speaking, and going far beyond the migraine syndrome, do not have this traditional feature, but they give it a big push forward. One of Hildegard's biographers, Theodoric, follows Hildegard herself by suggesting that as her illnesses got worse, more paralyzing and perhaps more frequently, she was afraid to tell the Disenbodenberg community that God had commanded her in a vision to leave and found a new monastic community in the Rupertsberg, in the wilderness. She was struck blind, paralyzed, immobilized for several days until she spoke about these newest divine instructions. It's instructive to read that text. Even in translation, the gracelessly correct Latin prose of her monastic biographer gives way to the tight, static, colloquial, but absolutely authoritative voice of the Sibyl of the Rhine, who makes it clear that even at that moment of life-altering courageousness, when she was going to pick up and leave and move someplace else, she was not yet fully freed from illness. She seems almost to have treasured that kind of infirmity. Whenever she was struck by it, she worked even harder and she accomplished even more. Later on, Hildegard's reverent biographer rose to a surprisingly sharp insight when he compared her to the Hebrew judge Deborah, whose leadership accomplished 40 years of peace for Israel. Perhaps that level of challenge was the core of the reason that Hildegard of Bingen, the holy hypochondriac, was a heroine to so many men and women of her day. What was the nature of Hildegard's vision and insight in the Civias? These are in large measure visions about joy in God, joy in nature, in that constantly mobile cosmic egg of creation, as Hildegard pictures it. She herself says, "It was in my vision that my first book of visions should be called Civias, no ways, because it was made known by way of the living brightness, not drawn from other teachings. I saw that all the ranks of the church have bright emblems in accord with the heavenly brightness, yet virginity has no bright emblem, nothing but a black veil and an image of the cross. I saw that this then would be the image of virginity, that a virgin's head would be covered with a white veil because of the radiant white robe that human beings had in paradise and lost. On her head would be a circlet with 3 colors conjoined into one, an image of the Trinity and 4 roundels attached. The one on the forehead showing the Lamb of God, that on the right the cherub, that on the left the angel, and on the back a human being, all these inclining towards the figure of the Trinity. This emblem granted to me will proclaim blessings of God before he had clothed and because he had clothed the first man in radiant brightness." It's so interesting to look at all of the different visions in the Civias And there's one place I want to look at in Civias 2:1, which seems to be Hildegard's own vision statement. Book 2 is about the redemption, which might have been closer to Hildegard's concerns than the creation to which Book 1 is dedicated. That sounds reasonable enough, doesn't it? Mightn't anyone feel a certain sense of urgency about one's own individual destiny, more than about the question of how the world itself came into being? And I, a person not glowing with the strength of strong lions or taught by their inspiration, but a tender and fragile rib, imbued with a mystical breath, saw a burning fire, incomprehensible, indistinguishable, wholly living and wholly life, with a flame in it the color of the sky, which burned ardently with a gentle breath, and which was inseparable within the blazing fire as the viscera are within the human being. And then she goes on, and in the earth too appeared a radiance like a dawn, into which the flame was miraculously absorbed without being separated from the blazing fire. And thus, in the radiance of that dawn, the supreme will was enkindled. Hildegard goes on, stepping away from the moment of that vision to what we might call the authorial present, and she continues in a very different tone. And as I was trying to ponder this enkindling of the will more carefully, I was stopped by a secret seal on my vision, and I heard the voice from on high saying to me, "You may not see any further regarding this mystery unless it's granted to you by a miracle of faith." And then it was so granted, as she saw man, homo, coming out of that dawn. And then she says the voice spoke to her from the living fire, "O you who are wretched earth, and as a woman, untaught in all learning of earthly teachers and unable to read literature with philosophical understanding, you are nevertheless touched by my light, which kindles in you a burning fire." The living God, then, who created all things through his word, by the word's incarnation, brought back the miserable human who had sunk himself into darkness to certain salvation. What does that mean? That was her question. It's a very good question. What does it mean? Hildegard now settles down in what I think we hear is her third voice in 17 short chapters of explanation. The first of these she entitles On God's Omnipotence, and she says, "The blazing fire that you see symbolizes the omnipotent and living God." And she goes on then to explain what the incomprehensible is, what the indistinguishable is, what the holy living is, what holy life means to her. Okay, this is just the sort of thing one expects from a medieval thinker, that one would have a vision and one would then have the explanation of this vision. What does she say about the book of Job? In some cases, she seems to us to be pre-scholastic. But let's look again at something that we see with Job. She says, "Who is ignorant of the hand of the Lord that has made all things? In his hand is the soul of every living creature and the spirit of all human flesh." What does this mean, says Hildegard? "No creature is so dull of nature as not to know what changes in the things that make it fruitful cause it to attain its growth. Hence man contains himself in the likeness of heaven and earth. In what way? He has a circle which contains his clarity, breadth, and reason, as the sky has its lights, air, and birds. And he has a receptacle containing humidity, germination, and birth, as the earth contains fertility, fruition, and animals." What is this? "O human, you are holy in every creature, and you forget your Creator. You are subject to him as ordained, and you go against his demands." Does this sound like Job to you? What she gives us here is one of her several metaphors for understanding the human person, including herself. Elsewhere, she offers metaphors for the human union of soul and body. Her metaphoric instinct is protean and inexhaustible. The Hildegard, who says, "Hence, O human, understand what you are in your soul, you who lay aside your good intellect and liken yourself to beasts," is the Hildegard who is dear to the votaries of the New Age and to many other kinds of late 20th and early 21st century sensibilities. This is the distinctive Hildegard. We have many other examples of beautiful speech from the Civias and other interpretations that we'll look at later from her other books. But one feature of Hildegard's thought that we might especially want to notice is her conviction, central to her sense of her mission, that virility is a highly desirable quality and that the effeminate male leaders of the church in her day lacked it. Hence, weak women like herself were called to virile speech and action.